Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom. We're going to pick right up where we left off in class talking about the growth of the medieval Catholic Church power during the medieval era. Isn't that right, Mr. PP? Yes, Mr. PP. He loves talking about the growth of medieval church power and stuff like that. So the big thing that we left off in class talking about after we did our intense review of the sacraments and all that stuff and talked about how the traditions of the Catholic Church that we actually talk about now were originally started during the medieval period, right? And we talked a lot of different stuff. We talked about the Inquisition, the interdictions, excommunications, like stuff like that. Well, the thing you need to understand is that church power is beginning to grow very rapidly, right? I told you that story about Gregory the Seventh and Henry the Fourth, right, of the King of Europe being like excommunicated and interdicted by a very arrogant and intense Pope. That is actually these guys right here. This is Henry actually coming back and begging for the Pope's forgiveness. Notice in the painting, though, what we're looking at is that Henry is much smaller than the Pope is, right? That is not actually due to the fact that Henry was short. It's actually much more due to the fact that the church genuinely believed that it was the most powerful secular authority in Europe, right? Secular. Let's chat about what that means real fast, okay? Secular means on earth, okay? Secular means like things that exist on this plane, in this life, on this planet that you can interact with on a daily basis, right? So like, for example, this right here is secular. Mr. PP, right? Like, so yes, Pierre is secular. The treat that I'm giving him right now is secular. However, our souls are not, right? God is not. Jesus is not. Well, he was at first. No, he's not. No, so like now, but you understand what I'm saying? Secular is a very important concept to understand too, because when we get into the Renaissance and stuff like that, it's going to start making a lot more sense, right? Because you got to understand the study of the heavens and the things outside of this place are very, very different from the study of the things around this place. Look at this little tree. Yeah, he's a baby. All right, so now look, the big thing about it, though, is this is going to lead to a church being very dominant and very powerful, and they're going to begin to claim this thing called papal supremacy, right? So popes are going to begin to kind of claim this authority and power over kings and other rulers and princes and government officials called papal supremacy, right? Papal meaning in the papacy or associated with the church, and supremacy meaning that they have the most power, supreme power, right? Now, why is this, right? Why would this get involved? Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that the church in the High Middle Ages is growing very, very wealthy, right? It's growing extremely wealthy and very powerful to boot, right? They also technically, by this point, have their own small country, right? Known as the Papal States, which is just south of the Holy Roman Empire, right? And the other thing that you need to understand about papal supremacy is they use this to their ability because the popes, the priests, the cardinals, and the bishops have a service that everyone in Europe wants and needs, which is that service of sacraments, that service of salvation. And so they begin to take this power and use it over them, right? Well, you can't get into heaven without us, so do X, Y, Z, right? That's papal supremacy or papal suprematic power. They're like, we can read, teach, and preach the Bible. So it's actually up to us whether you do anything at all, right? So that's very important to know that in the background of the High Middle Ages, we've got a very powerful church growing, right? And this papal supremacy is going to become a very, very large thing that helps lead into the Reformation later. And it's going to, of course, help lead into the ideas that you're talking about in Mr. Mathern's class, right? Now, going forward, though, we're also seeing a lot of kingdoms pop up. I told you before a second ago about the Papal States, right? The Papal States is right down here. There is the Holy Roman Empire. So at this point in history, in the medieval era, or in medieval history, we have kingdoms emerging. We have what you would now refer to as a country kind of popping up a little bit, right? We've got places like Kiev and Rus, which would eventually like evolve into Ukraine and Russia. We've got France. We've got the Christian kingdoms in northern Spain, which will begin to expand down and push the Muslims out further and become what you now know as Spain. You got the Byzantine still cruising around every year. But there's one really important one that we have to talk about who's going to set a very large standard for governmental practice and things like that going forward. And it's that of England, right? So England is going to be a very great use or a very great case study for us to look at and understand how kingdoms began to emerge. Where did they come from? How did you go from being barbarian to being like some kind of very astute political authority, right? So England serves as a really, really great one because of the people that originally settled it, right? The Angles and the Saxons, right? The Angles and the Saxons originally settled the Isle of England. The Angles slightly north and the Saxons down here towards the old Roman, towards the old Roman settlement that had been abandoned following the fall of Rome, right? So following 476 and the retraction of the Roman Empire, a city was left behind. It was called Londinium, right? Londinium would become London. The Saxons actually settled that area. Now, when the Angles and the Saxons began to interact with each other as well, they began to blend their languages, right? And when you used to spell England, it used to be spelled Angleland, or the land of the Angles, right? And that's where the word England comes from, right? And so that's why it's actually referred to as that. Also in the Saxon language, in Anglish, in the English-Saxon language, there was a letter that was an A and then it had an E. It was like a half an A, half an E. And so they kept the E eventually, just kept running with it. And that's what became England, right? But early on, when they originally immigrated to the British Isles, right? There were other people like the Britons that were there. There were the Celts, the Picts, there was other people as well. But the Angles and the Saxons are going to settle southern England and grow very, very strong and begin to expand. They were in separate kingdoms at first, and they each had their own laws and customs, until this very important figure comes along, known as Alfred the Great, right? Alfred the Great comes along, and he becomes the very first person that's the king of what you would refer to as the English, right? Like, so the king of the English, right? So the big thing about it is he comes along and he unites the Angles and Saxons together because they were being frequently raided by Vikings, right? There were a ton of different Viking invasions that were occurring, and the Vikings, as we know, those raiders from Scandinavia, were showing up and taking and pillaging and like stealing different items and stuff like that because there's a very, very famous understanding that when Danes arrive with the intent of war, it means they're coming as Vikings, right? And actually, it's Viking weekend this weekend at the Renaissance Fair, which I'm going to, and I'll see if the man Greg will actually let me take a picture with him, all right? Now, the thing about it that you also have to understand is that England, subject to these invasions, Alfred the Great is going to be forced to unite the Angles and Saxons together to defend themselves, right? And he unites the nobles and the lands under him to stop these invasions, and this has two very large effects, okay? You've got a merging of the two, like, barbarian tribes now called Anglo-Saxons, or creating the culture of English, right? Like so. And then also you've got another big thing, the tradition of a strong monarch in England, okay? Alfred the Great sets the tone early on of having a monarch in England all the time, right? And a strong one at that. One that leads a large military and one that leads a very, very strong, like, island nation, right? So that tradition of the monarch is a very big one as well. Well, Alfred the Great, of course, goes on to get married, have descendants, and he creates a hereditary monarchy. So his son inherits it after him, and then the son after that inherits it as well. And we keep going down his line over a couple of generations and stuff like that. We get to like his great-great-grandson, right? His great-great-grandson, I don't know if it's the right great-greats or not or whatever, but it doesn't really matter, was a very famous figure in English history, okay? And in English history, this great-grandson or whatever, this descendant of Alfred the Great, was also extremely pious, right? He was very, very religious. He was extremely devoted to his Catholic faith. So devoted, in fact, that he created a system, a network of archbishops and bishops that actually existed in England, and he also created the very beautiful church that we talked about in class the other day, right? That very, very pretty one that all of you are supposed to remember, the one known as Westminster Abbey, right? So like Westminster Abbey was created by this king in the medieval era, right? And he originally builds it, or has the foundations of it built, not necessarily in its Gothic architectural style, but has the foundations of it actually built in 960, as you can see right there. This very beautiful, huge Gothic cathedral now was originally probably built in Romanesque architecture, but he has it founded. And you are like, who is he? Who is he? Who is this guy that you keep talking about that you're acting like, why are you talking so much about him and not telling me his name? Because you know his name already. He has a grammar school in the area actually named after him. And his name is Edward the Confessor, right? Like, so now, his descendant is Edward the Confessor, right? So England progressed 200 years, and then one of their kings, Edward the Confessor, died, the one that was super pious, and the one that built Westminster Abbey. He died without any heirs to the throne. No children, no nothing like that, and that's going to lead to what is known as a secession crisis, okay? Do me a favor, just write down secession crisis. Secession crisis is spelled S-E-C-C-E-S-S-I-O-N, secession crisis. I don't know if it's two S's or not, but we'll figure it out together, okay? But a secession crisis is when a king dies with no heir, no brothers, and no one actually able to take the throne, so it must pass to a new family. Well, what always usually ends up happening is a very large war for the throne, and that's what we're going to clip in an old Flip talking about right now, because I got to go get changed and stuff like that, and I got to head up to Hammond so I can get to this event, all right? But I'll talk to y'all soon. Y'all do a great job. Keep up the good work. Big shout out to my A period. Y'all are so awesome. Keep it up. We were talking about a secession crisis, right? Well, what we left off in class was, of course, us accusing Molly Jernigan of being a witch and having an Inquisition trial for her, where apparently we deemed it necessary to, like, burn her at the stake or whatever. So, like, now the big thing is, like, it's that red hair, man. It's that red hair. Now, the big thing, though, going into it, y'all did a great job today. Very, very impressed. And it seems that we understand what's going on when it goes to, like, what we're moving into now, which is the establishment of some of these formal areas that you now know as modern-day France, right, from the Frankish kingdoms, right, the Holy Roman Emperor, the Holy Roman Empire is that middle chunk area in the middle right there, right? We've got other areas like include, like, the Italian city-states coming up later on. We know that, like, there's, like a half southern area of Spain that's got, like, controlled by the Muslim empires and stuff like that, which we'll talk more about them a little bit later on as well. But where we left off on is we were talking about the secession crisis that was occurring in England, right? So England would progress for 200 years after Alfred the Great united the Angles and the Saxons together, creating the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England, right? And understanding that we're going to start growing forward. Well, at the time, it wasn't called England. It was called, like, the Angle, or Land of the Angles, or Angland, right? So, but in 1066, some crazy stuff happens. One of Alfred's descendants, Edward the Confessor, the same guy who built Westminster Abbey, the same guy who, like, actually was considered the most pious of kings, the guy who is now even today a saint, known as Saint Edward the Confessor because of how pious he was, died with no heirs to the throne, right? Now, two people, technically three people actually, are going to claim the throne, okay? One of those guys is a Norwegian king named Harthoncourt from Norway, right? So that guy's kind of irrelevant, though. So, but that's this, just know in the back of your mind, like, some dude from Norway apparently also claims the throne, right? And so then you've got two other guys. One of them being a man by the name of Harold Godwinson, right? Harold Godwinson, who is the son of the man named Godwin, right? Because, again, Germanic tendencies. And so what's going to happen, though, is Harold Godwinson, or he's going to be the son of Godwin, and he has massive land holdings in all of southern England, right? He has a huge amount of writs, and he has a huge amount of title and land, and he is a noble of this area, and he is the one that's going to get crowned King of England, mainly due to the fact that he was the son of one of Edward's closest advisors, a man by the name of Godwin, right? Now, going forward, though, there was another man that's not even from England, and that guy is by the name of William of Normandy, right? William of Normandy, though, when he finds out that Harold Godwinson has been crowned King of England, he is furious, right? Now, just to give you a heads up, Normandy is in France. William of Normandy is from a northern region of France that you have probably heard of at one point or another if you've gone to the World War II Museum in New Orleans, right? Normandy is the same place where the D-Day invasion occurred, right? On the beaches of Normandy in northern France. So William of Normandy claims that a representative of Edward before he died said that actually Edward wanted to give the throne to him and his Normandy cousins and family, right? And so he claims that he had been promised the throne by Godwinson and Edward the Confessor before Edward even died, right? And so now we've got a war is about to break out, right? A huge war or a battle for the English throne is going to occur, and that fighting got intense. And that battle is known as the Battle of Hastings, right? Now look, going forward, there are 5 dates that you're going to need to know for this test. 5 of them, right? You're going to need to know 476, the fall of the Roman Empire. You're going to need to know 1066, the Battle of Hastings. So every single time from now on in class, if you hear me say Battle of Hastings, just go 1066, right? You just repeat that number back to me, okay? So if I say Battle of Hastings, you go 1066. If I say 1066, you go Battle of Hastings, okay? Like, you got to, like, sit up all straight and stuff like that. Just be, like, really intense about it. Right? Practice one time real fast. 1066. Battle of Hastings. Very, very nice, Lily. Good job. Even though you probably skipped over that, and that's why I'm going to count all your stuff on the fill in the blanks wrong. Now, anyway, going into it, though, the big thing you need to understand is that this Battle of Hastings is going to occur as a conflict over who should control England, right? Now, going into it, though, there we go. Unfortunately for Harold in this situation is that a total of 3 different people wanted to claim the throne of England, right? So in this process, he gets attacked on 2 sides, right? So Harold is located down here in London, right? Former city known as Londinium under the Romans, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the big thing about it is that Norwegian king by the name of Harthoncourt comes in from Norway in this direction, right? He lands in this northern area of England, and Harold's army has to march from London all the way up here and fight that Norwegian claimant to the throne here. He ends up winning that battle. It's a major, major victory for Harold, but now he has to turn around and march all the way back down because northern France is down here, and William of Normandy's forces have landed in this area close to Sussex in southern England, right? So since Harold's army is now so exhausted from the first battle in the north, he ends up losing that battle to William in the south, and Harold Godwinson actually dies in that battle, right? Harold Godwinson actually got shot in the eye with an arrow through his knight's helmet and through his helm. It sneaked through and ended up hitting him in the actual eye, and he was strapped into his horse, and he would just go, and he just starts flopping around all over the top of it, right? So now the big thing, though, that ends up happening is now that Harold has died because of this actual invasion that occurred in the north as well, who is going to claim the throne but William of Normandy, right? So William is now going to become King of England, but wait a second, he's French, right? So one of the biggest outcomes of this battle is the fact that on December 25th, 1066, on Christmas Day, William of Normandy would be crowned the King of England. Problem is that the day that he showed up, apparently, actually after he got crowned King of England, he stepped out onto a giant balcony on the palace in London, and he presented himself before the English people, and the English people actually cheered for him. They were like, "Yeah, William, you're awesome!" And they actually cheered for him for one major reason, because they knew that William, being French, was going to centralize powers and claims under him, and he was going to take a lot of these different English lands from some of these Anglish people, right? And so since they were taking that land, that means that as them being serfs, maybe those contracts would be null and void, and some of them would be allowed to leave, right? Now, the unfortunate thing that ended up happening before that whole process started is the day that he walked out and was like, "Yeah, look, I'm king now." All the people were like, "Yeah, you're king now. We're so excited." He spoke French. They were yelling at him in English. He thought they were yelling at him in a mean way, so apparently William of Normandy snapped his fingers and sent the army out into London, and they burned like a third of the city to the ground, right? Actually trying to get after people because he thought they were yelling mean things at him because he couldn't understand what they were saying. So what's going to end up happening is, write this down, French and Anglish, the land of the Angles, a Germanic-style language, are going to mix together, and that is actually where we get modern-day English from, right? English is the reason why it doesn't follow any proper Latin-derived languages or German-derived language rules, mostly due to the fact that it's actually a mixture of both a Germanic language and a Latin language, right? So, actually, that's why we have so many cognates in French, English, Spanish, etc. For example, we talked about that today in class, right? In German, when you say God, you say Gott, right? So, but in French, when you say God, it's du, right? So, and actually, that's due to the Latin Deus, right? And that's where they get their word for God from, du, as in du est bon, as in God is good, whereas in German, it's Gott ist gut. Yeah, as in good, okay? So, that whole, sentence, Gott ist gut, shows you how German English is. But then if you look at other words we use, for example, I don't know, animal, or other or hippopotamus, hippopotam. If you look at those different words, they're very, very French, right? So looking at this entire thing though, William of Normandy does end up actually consolidating all the land and power underneath him, and he basically creates the modern day country of England. Now he also becomes a new name. He actually gets called now William the Conqueror, right? Now, one of the biggest things that he does after the blending of English and French come together, because all the English people tried to learn French to talk to him, he tried to learn English to talk to them, and so that modern day English would be the thing that's birthed out of that. He also came up with this thing known as the Doomsday Book, right? So when he came to power, he began to create a system of surveying everything in England, the land, everything they owned, and stuff like that. And by doing this, he could then effectively create a tax system based on the amount of items a person owned or a group of people owned, right? So it created a very efficient tax system, and it sets up England to be, this is another big thing, one more time, other little result, okay? Because we have another major impact. So our other major impacts include of William the Conqueror taking over all of England and actually becoming King of England. Big thing, Battle of Hastings. Good job, Gabriella. Now, so the big thing, though, is actually looking at this whole thing. We've got modern-day English be born because of this event. And the other major impact is now because the King of England is a Frenchman, you're going to see England become much more like continental Europe in culture and status rather than being Scandinavian like Sweden, Norway, and Finland, okay? So their culture actually will derive the most of itself from continental Europe rather than being Scandinavian, right? So that's very, very important as well. Now, moving into the next thing that we're going to be talking about in class,
we're going to be discussing, not the Renaissance, but we're going to be discussing the Crusades next, right? So if the Battle of Hastings occurred in 1066, we're then going to be moving on and talking about the Crusades in our next class, right? So the Crusades were a series of very, very aggressive holy wars that occurred during the era of about 1099 all the way up until like the 1200s or late 1200s, right? So we're talking about wars that lasted for over like several hundred years. But they weren't continuous, and there were several of them, right? It was the First Crusade and the Second Crusade and all this other stuff. And the thing that you need to know about the Crusades before I let you go is that the Crusades were a series of religious wars fighting over the same exact city, right? That city being Jerusalem, right? So Jerusalem is referred to as the Holy Land to three separate religions. Now, to Jewish people and Christian people, it is the Holy Land, the city, the main place, right? And you can actually see that in some of the ruins that are left right here, right? So looking at this, you've got places like the Dome of the Rock, which is built on top of a Jewish temple, and then you also, well, even though it's now a Muslim site, and then you also have a Muslim prayer tower right there, a minaret, but then this right here is known as the Wailing Wall. The Wailing Wall is considered one of the most holy sites for Jewish people to actually go to, because it is one of the last retaining walls of this Jewish temple that was actually burned down by the Romans, right? And so looking at it, though, as you can see, there's a huge crowd down here in Jerusalem coming to visit this entire area. They actually go through a very special binding ceremony on their arms, and then they actually like go up to the wall, they say a certain set of prayers, and then they also write their prayers down on a piece of paper, and they slip them into the cracks of the wall because it is believed that they are at a holy site and that their prayers will be easier to get to God through that wall, right? Now, some people always ask what happens when the Wailing Wall fills up with like prayers or whatever. Well, they just actually like brush them off and they burn them in a holy ceremony. But looking at the entire thing, the thing to focus on is that this holy site is in Jerusalem, the Wailing Wall, just like the Dome of the Rock is in Jerusalem, and that's for Muslim people. And then Christians also view Jerusalem as a holy city because it is in this city that Christ both ascended to heaven and also was crucified, right? And it's also where most of his major preachings and things would go down. So like this city becomes massively important to people of all faiths during the medieval era period for Western Europeans, and also during the Golden Age Eastern period as well for Muslim people, and also as well for the Jewish communities throughout both of those different sectors. Now, the Crusades, though, were these series of Holy Land like wars to like take that Holy Land back, and they're going to occur both in the High and Late Middle Ages. So what you're going to need to do now, tomorrow, we're going to outline Islam, kind of talk about it as a religion, and then we're going to move into the Crusades, what they are, and things like that. But I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one.
Excuse me.